AMD is not only the topic of this video, but of what seems like every conversation this week, and for good reason. But anyways, welcome to the channel. I really appreciate you being here, and if you don't mind, please hit that like button and also subscribe so that you get notifications anytime something new comes out by me. I can promise you this is very valuable information, and just as a checklist item, this is not financial advice. It's just my experience in the market and a little bit of a story on how I got to where I am as an investor. So without much further ado, this video is going to be going over an AMD overview. This overview was for a presentation that I made at the Rocky Mountain Investment Challenge competition that was taking place last year in Wyoming, at the University of Wyoming. It was a great event. It was very fun to be there, and a great opportunity to learn, but also deepen my understanding about AMD. So some things that we're going to be talking about today is, so one, we'll be going through an overview of AMD, a deep dive into their business model, and then afterwards we'll be talking about some current events. So it's important that you stay tuned through the whole thing, not only so that you understand AMD as a company, but then also how you understand like how they're positioning themselves in current news. I mean, this stuff came out Monday. It's now Sunday. I wanted to kind of see what happened over the week, and so this is a very interesting video. And another thing I want to say is congratulations to all the other AMD shareholders out there. I've been working with AMD since 2017, as you might have seen by the title or the thumbnail. I haven't decided yet, but yeah, I've been accumulating AMD since 2017. So you know, Monday's 35% move or whatever it was an extreme validation point, and just a good time to be an AMD investor after so much of the time it just being the Nvidia show, for just a lack of better terms. But anyways, let me dive into this presentation. Like I said, it's from last year, but I've obviously updated things as they need to be, especially numbers that have come out in their most recently quarterly earnings. So this is a very important video for you guys to tune into, and that's why I wanted to start it off like this. So anyways, I'm going to be switching to show you guys the presentation either behind me or something like that. But we'll begin with a brief overview about the company, followed by the financial standing as well as the business model of AMD. Then we'll be getting into some of their products in their portfolio as well as the market opportunity associated. And then I probably need to back up a little bit from this mic. And then we'll be getting into an industry analysis as well as the barriers to entry, and show why what AMD is doing makes it so hard to replicate, as well as the growth outlook, revenues, and of course valuation and recommendations. At the time, this competition had a requirement of 15% by the company that you pitch. So we had to pitch a company that we believed would perform at the very least 15%, and AMD has blown those numbers out of the water. So you'll kind of see that as we get towards that valuation, and our recommendation actually being a good one at that. So all right, let's jump into the overview. So AMD, or Advanced Micro Devices, is a best-in-class company on the bleeding edge of technology in the semiconductor industry. They were founded on May 1st, 1969, and they're headquartered out of Santa Clara, California. They're led by the Time Magazine 2024 CEO of the Year, Dr. Lisa Su, who has been with the company since 2014, making tremendous strides. As when she stepped in, the share price was around $2 and some change, and then they are now currently trading at $235. So, and that was sometime this past week. It's been a little up and down, as you might expect some sell-offs coming through, but still a tremendous company and a huge turnaround that she's done. Some of the main competitors include Intel, Nvidia, and Qualcomm. The reason why we chose these competitors to mention is not particularly telling of the entire competition with semiconductors. It's really an Nvidia and AMD show, especially as Intel is, kind of taking a shift towards being the manufacturing entity. And Qualcomm was just another mentionable in here, but I would really say this is an Nvidia AMD story. But even at that, Nvidia and AMD are thrown into the same bucket quite often, but they're very, very different companies and focus on very different things, although they do both design semiconductors. So anyways, jumping more into an overview of this, we see that Advanced Micro Devices is a fabless design company. Not fabulous, but they are fabulous. A fabless design company, which means that they do none of the fabrication. They're doing only the design and outsourcing the fabrication of these designs, which allows them to be, the next point, a profit engine. You know, they get to focus on what they're very good at and continue to improve designs while outsourcing manufacturing to some of the best in the world, like TSMC. And we will potentially see Intel taking on some of that responsibility as they get a lot of incentive from the government via the CHIPS Act, and then also these partnerships that we're seeing amongst the semiconductors like NVIDIA and AMD with Intel to make that happen. So, like I was saying, being a design company, AMD is enabled to focus on the future of technology. Their CEO, Dr. Lisa Su, says, and she said something like this, maybe not verbatim, but they literally have to see the future. They have to see the future and pull that tech into the present. And so that's something that allows them to be at the very bleeding edge of this technology. And then this leads to immense scalability. The scalability of AMD is in a very nice position because the world needs more compute. Compute. That's all it is. And there is an increasing amount of demand. I probably said that funny. There's an increasing amount of demand for these chips and for high power compute, especially as these businesses that are utilizing the computations become more competitive. And that whole landscape is just creating a self-fulfilling prophecy that AMD is right at the center of. So now that we can get into some financial standings of AMD, as you can see here, this is for the full year 2024, and there's obviously been quarterly reports since then. I have some notes on that. So things like these quick ratios have not really changed in any significant way. The main point to take away from these ratios is that AMD is in a very, very healthy position. Their quick ratio is very healthy, 1.6. Their debt to equity ratio of 0.2 is phenomenal. They barely have any debt. I believe their capital structure is 98 or 99.8% weighted in equity. So there's really no risk of like things that were happening in 2014 when they had really bad balance sheets and AMD was not looking as pretty as they do today. Anyways, these ratios are still in very healthy standing. But as we look at the summary for the full year P&L, we see that revenues are continuing to grow, up 14% year over year. That was 2014. Currently, in Q2 of 2025, that was 7.68 billion, 7.7 billion. That's 32% year over year, and puts them on pace to be at 30.7 billion. For the year. So yeah, top line's running above 2024, which is something great that you love to see. And as we go down the list, we see that Q2 2025 was up 7% year over year with a gross profit of about 3.05 billion. So that's looking at a run rate of about 12.2 billion, close to the full year 2024. Gross profit is up 7% year over year, with a run rate looking at 12.2 billion. It's close to the full year 2024. Not too concerned there. When we look at the gross margin, they did take a hit in Q2 of 2025, and that was due to the 800 million in inventory-related charges tied to the MI300X export controls. But that was the prudent thing to do. That's what Lisa Su had called it. NVIDIA had I believe recognized that revenue or didn't. The charges that I think were up to 5.4 or 5.6 billion for NVIDIA, they didn't have it negatively impact their balance sheet and their report. So yeah, AMD is doing the prudent thing. Essentially what's going on here is Dr. Lisa Su tends to underpromise and overdeliver. She doesn't speak with a heavy hand like Jensen Huang does for NVIDIA. Jensen's a little bit more outspoken and a little bit more boastful, while Lisa Su is a little bit more humble and conservative, and so that's why we see the gross margin being affected by the issues with China. But the funny thing about that is NVIDIA is having full-on bans from within China. China doesn't want anybody using NVIDIA chips in their closed software, whereas AMD is getting the okay to sell their stuff in there. And so things are working out for Lisa Su, especially even though she didn't recognize that $800 million in inventory-related charges that would be affected by China. So at least she's able to sell there. NVIDIA is having difficulty with even that. All right. Now, as we go down the line to operating expenses, we see that it's up about 23% year over year, with Q2 reporting at 3.19 billion or 3.2 billion. And so this run rate totals to about 12.8 billion. This is a step up that reflects heavier R&D and SG&A for AI, and this is just one of the functions of AMD just reinvesting in themselves. So, all right, operating expenditures, revenue. Okay, so about 42% as well, essentially flat with the full year 24. As we look at operating income, that was 1.9 billion, and for Q2 25, that was 134 million. That's a GAAP loss on export-related charges. Non-GAAP operating income 897 million, shows that the core operations are still profitable. So, not too concerned there. Everybody knew there was going to be some impact on the regulation, the chip regulations between China and the United States, and this is kind of that playing out. But it's more of like a dent that doesn't really throw you off. It just is not exactly the brightest spot. But this is something that the show must go on kind of thing, and AMD is going to continue performing and making better and better chips on the bleeding edge. So for operating margin, we're looking at 2% GAAP and 12% non-GAAP. Then for the net income, that was at 1.64 billion, and for Q2 2025, that was 872 million GAAP, and this includes that $834 million tax benefit, and 104 million from discontinued operations. So the trend is stronger than typical, given the tax item. So the last thing I'm going to talk about here is the earnings per share, and that was at $1 for 2024 full year, and for Q2 2025 we're looking at 54 cents. So that's a little diluted. It's a quarterly figure. If repeated, that's $2 annualized. But remember, quarter two's earnings per share was boosted by that tax benefit. All right, so now that we got some of that financial stuff out of the way, I'm very excited to. I really like qualitative stuff. Quantitative is great, and I'll never shy away from it. But I think when you're looking at companies for the future, it's not always possible to quantitate the future. You have to qualify it and see how it may be, and then from there you can build, maybe some quantitative expectations backwards. And so that's kind of where I like to sit in. It's good to know the financials, and those things are great, especially things like operating expenses, free cash flow, things of that nature, things that AMD does a really good job of managing. And but now let's get a little bit further. Okay, looking at AMD's products, we see there are three segments of gaming and PC, data center, and embedded. All right, looking at their products, I think the biggest thing to take note of here is the diversity amongst these products. I mean, and not only gaming, PC, data center. Many of you may know that AMD is in your PlayStation, it's in your Xbox, it's in your Switch. So they're all over gaming, they're all over PCs. Data center, they're becoming a sleeper favorite, and we kind of saw that with OpenAI's deal with AMD, and some of the other giants like Oracle talking about NVIDIA slipping or causing a slip in margins due to inefficiencies that AMD is able to capitalize on. So I think the biggest thing to check out here is, at least under, now that we've talked about gaming and data centers, for the embedded section, AMD is getting their hands in every single pot. They're trying to get in aerospace, automotives, telecom, healthcare. They want to be everywhere, and they want to find a way to benefit every industry, and they're doing so very well with their deep partnerships. But now let's jump into an industry analysis. So this is kind of important just understanding the landscape, and it's becoming a little increasingly difficult to understand the minute differences between each company and their advantage. So one thing that's very important to notice is that AMD's hand is in each one of these pots for CPUs, GPUs, and APUs. AMD has really made a name for themselves with their CPUs, taking market share from the giant at the time, Intel, and continuing to make great strides with that, as well as their GPUs that are now becoming comparable to NVIDIA's. So another thing that they're able to do with that are their APUs, and I don't say it specifically here, but their chiplet architecture. AMD is able to combine compute units for optimization at whatever those individual units are best at. And so these personalized chips are just able to do specialized tasks very, very well. And a big part of that is being able to do serial computations, as in one after the other, and parallel computations where you're doing multiple at once together in these chiplet compute units. So that's a huge part that AMD is able to accelerate at by making chips that are specialized and do their tasks very, very well. Now, one thing I want to talk about is the barriers to entry. So AMD is becoming increasingly harder to replicate with their trajectory of innovation and transformation in the industry as a whole for semiconductors. So, I mean, at the top of that list is their patented intellectual property and talent. So Dr. Lisa Su is an MIT graduate, and many of the intellectual property is her own. And so she is technically not a founder, but she leads this company as if it was. She's really transformed everything that AMD does or has done since 2014 when she came and took over, and has transformed the company to where it's really her will that's allowed it to get where it is. So that talent is really hard to come by, especially from a leader, but also within the company, their employees are very, very talented as well. So another thing that makes it very difficult for an average Joe to make a semiconductor company that competes with the likes of NVIDIA and AMD is these things require massive capital. You can't just make this in your garage as much as you may like to at the same scale and quality that AMD does. The next thing about that is the supply chain. These are very interconnected supply chains, and there's often a line to get your chips manufactured because of the steep demand. Regulatory and compliance is very difficult as well, as we see AMD and NVIDIA battling with. AMD less so, as they're able to sell their chips freely in China, but NVIDIA is still battling with that. They have export controls and people literally waiting at the border searching for NVIDIA chips. China doesn't want them used in their country, and a lot of that has to do with the technological differences between closed source and open source, AMD being open. So yeah, these things are very difficult to replicate and make it hard to become a competitor in this space, or even remain a competitor in this space. The next big thing is ecosystem partnerships and data, and the ecosystem piece at least comes down to what I was saying about software, open versus closed. NVIDIA has become the status quo with their closed source, similar to Apple. It's always been analogous to Apple, as a lot of people describe, the dichotomy between Apple versus Android. That's kind of the comparison between NVIDIA and AMD. And open source, which AMD participates in, is just becoming more and more obvious as fruitful and a better source to actually progress technology, and history has shown that as well. Collaboration increases the quality of ideas and the quantity as well. So, all right, jumping into the market growth, these are some things I'm gonna have to look at the newest reports on to compare. All right, the note that I want to make here are just the recent growth drivers. So data centers up 14% year over year, with the client side up 67% year over year. And the gaming segment up 73% year over year in Q2 2025. So these different segments are making tremendous strides for the company, and the opportunities seem to keep coming, which brings us into the next piece of market opportunities. All right, for right here, I'll just break it down into some near term and long term. So in the near term, management guides to a 28% year over year revenue growth at the midpoint for Q3 2025, as well as the longer term poll. AMD expects the OpenAI deal to drive tens of billions in revenue over time. The beauty of that, and we'll be getting into it later, is also the incentives for stock price for AMD. And that's really why we're here, as we're investors talking about investing in AMD for the stock. So when we look at the warrants that were released for 160 million shares to be purchased by OpenAI from AMD, they're contingent on the stock price being $600 to get them those shares at a penny per share, which is, this deal is somewhat unheard of, and I don't want to. I'd rather get into that at the end of the video, so that we can focus more on this. But I mean, that's just going to be a tremendous long-term opportunity, and that long-term I don't think is going to be very long-term. I think 2026 is the year that AMD touches 600, and I think 2027 to 2020, from 2027 to 2030. AMD has a chance to run to $1,000 stock with that meteoric rise, just like NVIDIA did. Then we're talking about splits. Then we're talking about some really exciting stuff, okay? Anyways, let's not get too ahead of ourselves with that. And we'll jump into some of the risk factors. All right, so one of the risk factors I'll talk about is the license under review. So there's no MI300X China revenue in AMD's Q3 outlook. You know, there's a good chance that goes through and then things start looking a lot better. I don't think that's going to make or break AMD, and that's not just an AMD story. I mean, NVIDIA is dealing with this same issue to a greater extent. So one thing I'll make a note of on this for the segment is embedded was down 4% year over year in Q2 2025, and the demand was described as mixed. I think that's going to be one of those segments that waxes and wanes. I think it's going to overall be increased, especially as we approach, some really transformative things in our lifetime. Talking about driverless cars, robotics everywhere, and AI. A lot of these things are becoming increasingly prevalent, but when it's really affecting our lives on a day-to-day basis, that'll be as a function of AMD's embedded segment really working its magic. And not to say that NVIDIA can't contribute to that as well, but I'm pretty firm in my beliefs of AMD kind of taking the show here. Anyways, let's look at the revenue catalyst. So at the time, the geopolitics that this came out, this was April, I believe, or somewhere around April time. I can't remember exactly when we presented, but geopolitics were looking like, a real headwind. But we had actually described them as a tailwind, which I think is exactly how it played out. The decisions being made at the top were to orient towards the success of the United States. And how did we get the success of the United States? Well, it's through these chips. And so it needed a little bit of protection and a little bit of a slight course adjustment to ensure that. And that's what the tech race between the United States and China really looks like. And the governmental support has not ceased, not through a blue president, not through a red president, and that will persist. All right, some things I want to mention for the ramping up of AI is the MI300X accelerators and EPYC CPUs. So these are near-term catalysts, and AMD reiterated robust AI demand. So these are good for the short term, as well as these partnerships since last year that include OpenAI, and ecosystem expansions between Red Hat, Nokia on EPYC. These things are just tremendous for AMD as a company, and partnerships that you're seeing on the screen that have existed between Microsoft, Meta, OpenAI, and Sony, as well as new handheld and console systems. I mean, these are all just bonuses to the revenue for AMD, and we still expect those to continue to rise for revenues. So for the full revenue breakdown, we look at 3 splits between data centers, gaming segments, and the embedded segment. And we see the latest quarterly mix for Q2 2025 with data centers at $3.24 billion, client at $2.5 billion, and gaming at $1.12 billion with embedded at $0.82 billion. Data center posted a $155 million operating loss in the quarter, mainly from the MI300X export control charges. I mean, that was a kick down, but like I said, I think it's more of a bump in the road than a total than getting totaled on the road. The next thing I want to look at is the free cash flow chart that we have right here from Bloomberg, showing the predictions from 2022 all the way through 2027, and we see that we see that going up quite nicely, with those dips being representative of reinvestment into the business, and then the gains thereafter being the results of reinvesting into the business. So things that you love to see as an investor, the things that are done with these are things that you love to see as an investor. We love to see companies using their free cash to create a better business that creates more and more money, and that just ultimately drives value over time. So AMD is continuing to deliver on that, and I expect that to really be blown out in these next quarterly earnings reports. So as we get into the investment summary, some things I'm going to say are, watch share count dilution. Watch the share count and the dilution. AMD did issue warrants to Openai for up to 160 million shares, with milestones that they achieved to unlock that. And so that's potentially a 10% stake in Advanced Micro Devices, versus 1.62 billion shares outstanding today. So yes, there will be some share dilution as these things come to be, but AMD's share price will be at all-time highs of $600 for these things to go through. So there's a little bit of give and take, but there's nothing that isn't mutual about this partnership. So AMD is working. There's nothing that isn't mutual about this partnership. Both parties are walking away very, very happy. AMD, who does all of their financing through equity essentially, is going to have now a $600 stock price with a much broadened market cap of their company. OpenAI is going to have a 10% stake, and they'll have a very easy time distributing their products and services with AMD at their side. OpenAI should be very excited about this deal, especially in the regards of financing. Pretty much everything that OpenAI has to buy from AMD will be paid for if these warrants go through, and then they get the strike price of stock at those prices. Things are looking good, especially in that department. So now, as we get to the valuation results, this was interesting to present on in Wyoming because, the competition was asking for a minimum of 15%, which in my opinion was like, dude, AMD's going to do that on accident in their sleep, which they did. So we ended up using very, very conservative metrics to come up with this valuation. We talk about, even with our most conservative models, it was tough to not blow out numbers to get something close to 15%. We ended up with something like 106% on the upside after, finding the EBITDA multiplier and even using a more conservative version of that. One thing I want to make a comment on is their capital structure. So if you look at on that blue chart, you see 98.9% of their weight is in equity, and only 1.1 is in debt. They're not really at risk of not being able to service their debt, especially when they have gobs of cash that they're sitting on. So, while that might make their average cost of capital a little bit more expensive, and it's kind of funny because my banking finance professor was like, well, geez, they could raise the value of the company like this if they were to just, adjust the weights a little more. But the reason why these weights are what they are is so that AMD can pivot very quickly to maintain at the bleeding edge of these technologies. And this is a common thing that you'll see even NVIDIA with their capital structure set up like. And this is something necessary to stay at that bleeding edge, like I said. But anyways, we look at the analyst recommendations at the time, and like I said, I believe this was sometime after April, still at very low prices for the entire market, but as well as AMD. I believe they were trading at $98 at this time. I might have said that on the last page. No. But we were looking at analyst projection highs of $225 with a low of $120, and at the time AMD was trading below $100. So all of these, even at the lowest, were satisfying that 15% that this competition needed. So very convincing stuff for me at the time to go and buy some more, especially when you look at the average just being an easy 40-50% upside right there. So yeah, what we came to with our final recommendation was obviously a buy. It's a screaming buy, especially at that time, trading near $90. I wish I had the current stock price on there. I know that we were referencing it throughout the presentation, but yeah, it was about $98. It was definitely below 100 at the time. Could have even been near 80s in its price. But yeah, the upside, I mean, we were blowing out the 15% minimum requirement by like twice that for our lowest projection. And it was very exciting to see AMD hit these numbers. When they first crossed that 47% upside and crossed 140, I texted all the boys, hey, we did it. And then when they crossed 194, I was like, hey, we did it for real. And then when they crossed the 225, which was on the previous page of the highest analyst predictions, and that was this Monday, I was like, guys, we were really on to one. And very exciting moment to see such a large upside. And I think that was pretty good for an overview, just to talk about some of the basics with AMD. So now might be a great time to talk about this OpenAI deal. So yeah, I woke up 5 in the morning to my dad calling me saying, check your stuff. And at first I was mad. I was like, man, what are you waking me up for? And then I see OpenAI and AMD make a deal. And the reason why this is such a big deal, I kept alluding, I'll talk about this later, because it needs its own separate thing to talk about. This is such a big deal because this is a leading indicator for what's going to happen in terms of a capitulating event where people swing from riding NVIDIA, who's been the golden child for forever, to the actually better performing AMD. This is that transition. This is where that happens. And so basically, OpenAI is the hottest chick in high school, okay? And she just said, I want to get with AMD. What do you think every other chick in high school is going to want to do? Get with AMD. And it's that simple. I mean, to use a layman's analogy like that, it's that simple. OpenAI is the big dog in this space, especially when it comes to AI and anything that you interact with. OpenAI is the big dog, and when you're the big dog, people follow. And some extra good news couldn't have come at a better time. Right after OpenAI said this, Oracle came out of the closet and was talking about how their margins are slipping because of the inefficiencies with NVIDIA, and that comes down to energy efficiencies, as well as token efficiencies, as well as just cost efficiencies. NVIDIA charges whatever they want for it because there's no other comparison, and companies need it. And so the fact that AMD comes in at a much more attractive price for the actual chips, they're more efficient, and you get more usage per token. This is just a thing that's been kind of a hush-hush secret that freaking Jim Cramer doesn't want you to know, because he doesn't, I don't know what he knows, but it seems like a whole lot of nothing. But there's been a whole thing with the sentiment of Wall Street and just investors in general that have just been gravitating towards NVIDIA. And there's a huge shift coming. When the hottest girl in the room doesn't say I want NVIDIA and they say I want AMD, you see something like what happened on earlier this week with AMD and their rocket ship freaking 35% on the day or whatever, and then the next day another 10 or 15% or whatever they did. They had a great week, and of course sell-offs came in, as you could expect. I mean, I've been buying since 2017, and I know there's plenty of people that were buying even earlier than me. I bought as early as $10 a share. Some people have $2 a share, $4 a share, and so yeah, I mean, once it hit their number, I'm sure that's what plenty of the sell-off was. But I really expect AMD to continue rising, especially with this incentive deal for OpenAI. They have mutual incentive to get AMD's stock to $600. OpenAI wants that stock to be $600 because that basically means they paid for all of their freaking infrastructure for free from AMD. Everything that they have to do to buy chips with, it'll be repaid after that stock is is materialized and those warrants are executed at that stock price that it's contingent on. So. There's just mutual benefit for both companies to get there. Let's see. There's so much more that I could get into, but unfortunately time is just limited, and I know you guys have plenty of other things to do than just sit here and have me talk about AMD, even though this is something I could do all day. I'm gonna try to cut it off there. But don't worry, I'll be back with some more information very shortly about AMD, but as well as some other companies in my portfolio that I'm very excited on. And yeah, thank you again for staying tuned. Please like this video if you enjoyed it. Please subscribe so that you can stay tuned for more. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Thank you.